state. Our first speaker, we've got two excellent speakers, and you've already heard their self-introductions this morning. We're going to be talking about the elections wrap-up. We'll start with national, and we'll have Jennings speak, and then we'll move along to John Dadian to talk about our local, state, and regional elections. So Jennings, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Great, thanks Teresa. Thanks for having me, and good to see everybody on Zoom, and looking forward to seeing everybody in person, hopefully in a few months here as vaccines start to get underway and we can get back to normal at some point. I don't know, maybe in the spring or early summer of next year. Fingers crossed that'll all go well. Happy to kind of give a rundown of what happened, obviously, on election night, kind of talk about it from the U.S. Chamber's perspective, and then give some insights as to what that might mean moving forward into 2021. I'm sure that all of you have heard quite a bit about the election since it happened, obviously, and have read various things about it and various assessments on it. I think, from the U.S. Chamber's standpoint, I think overall there were some really good things that came out of election night. First of all, when you look at our strategy, our political strategy that we really devised in the aftermath of the 2018 midterms, we came up with a couple of major priorities that we wanted to exercise in 2020. The first priority was to maintain a pro-business majority in the Senate. And then the second priority was to identify House Democrats, centrist Democrats that were pro-business or friendly on business issues, identify those folks that we could support, identify those folks that we could endorse, and in particular, looking at that huge freshman class that came in 2018. And obviously 7 of those members were from the state of California. We endorsed several of them as a way to try to build a pro-business, moderate contingent Democrat Party on the House side that could be really kind of integral in getting things done and building a bridge with Republicans to push issues that address our nation's biggest problems. So those were really the two biggest issues, or the two main kind of strategy points that we identified after 2018. On the Senate side, I'd say that we had a very good night. I think that we, along with a lot of other folks, were quite frankly fairly surprised as to how that played out on the Senate. A lot of the forecasts that we had seen in the weeks and months leading up to election night were indicating that Democrats were the favorite to take control of the Senate. Of course, they only needed to flip 3 seats if they won the presidency, 4 seats if they didn't win the presidency, with Republicans maintaining a 53-47 advantage going in. And a lot of the forecasters were saying, there's something like a 70-80% likelihood that Democrats were going to pick up the Senate. That obviously did not happen. I think the assumption as well going in, when you look at it race by race, was that there were 2 races in particular that where Republicans were considered most vulnerable and were likely to be pickups for Democrats. That was in Colorado and Arizona, with Cory Gardner in Colorado being down considerably in a state that has trended blue, obviously, over the years. And then Martha McSally, who had consistently been down in Arizona between 5 and 10 points, really for much of 2020. I think that was the assumption, that the Democrats would pick up those 2 seats and that Republicans would pick up Alabama. Obviously being a very conservative red state, Doug Jones being the Democrat there was a heavy underdog. And so the assumption was that would be kind of the baseline. The bare minimum for Democrats would be to pick up at least 1 seat to bring the margin down to 52-48 in favor of Republicans. And then there were really kind of 3 key Senate seats that were considered toss-ups that we identified at the U.S. Chamber, that I think a lot of pollsters and forecasters identified, that would ultimately sway and really determine who would have control of the Senate in 2021. Those 3 races were Maine, where Susan Collins was obviously in a very tough race. She was considered very vulnerable. Most of the polls that had been conducted over the course of 2020 showed her down, even in some by a considerable margin, although that started to tighten in the month or so leading up to the election. But a lot of folks were pretty down on her chances. And then the fact that they have ranked choice voting in Maine was another obstacle for her. She had to get over 50% in order to avoid a potential fiasco with ranked choice voting. So it looked as though the odds were very much stacked against Susan Collins in Maine. The other 2 races being in Iowa and North Carolina. Iowa, where Joni Ernst was running for re-election. She had also been down for several months, between 2 and 4, 2 and 5 points, fairly consistently. Her opponent had raised an enormous sum of money, and that's another kind of trend that we saw in this election across the board, was just outrageous amounts of money that were going particularly into these Senate contests. So Joni Ernst was another one that was a key race. And then the other race was in North Carolina, as I mentioned, with Tom Tillis, also either being dead even or down a couple of points pretty much consistently for most of the year. Very few polls that had been conducted over the last several months leading up to the election had any of those Republican members in the lead. And it was, like I said, that was kind of, those were the three races that had been identified that would determine control of the Senate. All three went for the Republicans. In fact, there were some surprises in the margin. For example, if you look at Maine, the fact that Susan Collins pulled off a 9-point victory when, I mean, she was kind of considered dead in the water back in the summer and even early parts of the fall of this year. Joni Ernst pulling off a 6-point victory in Iowa, another big surprise, as I mentioned, just given the massive amount of spending against her. Tom Tillis with a 2-point victory, outperforming the president even in North Carolina. That was big. And then you look at some of the other races as well. And I should also mention, before I move on to some of those other races, that the U.S. Chamber, because we had identified those as key races, and because all three of those Republican members were great friends of the business community, we devoted a lot of our resources to defending those seats. In particular, we spent a lot of money on various ads for Susan Collins and for Joni Ernst, especially over the last couple of months. So we were happy to see that pay off. And then some of the other races you look at, there was a lot of talk about South Carolina, right? And Lindsey Graham being potentially in trouble with his opponent raising, once again, just kind of outrageous sums of money. I think that his opponent had a quarter where he raised right around $57 or $58 million in a single quarter. Lindsey Graham ended up winning that seat by 10 points. So not all that close. Same thing for Texas. There's kind of been consistently over the last couple of years talk about Texas being more competitive, Texas trending purple. We saw John Cornyn pull off about a 10-point victory there as well. Montana was another one where Steve Daines, the incumbent, was being challenged by the Governor Bullock, who was a very popular Democrat governor in the state of Montana. Polling showed that race was very tight. Daines ended up winning by 10 points as well. So I think overall, a really strong performance from Republicans in the Senate. The fact that they only lost that one seat is key. So we're at a 52-48 split right now. That 52, of course, is assuming that Republicans hold on to both seats in the the runoff in Georgia. I think that's kind of, that was kind of one area where Republicans wish that they probably would have done better, quite frankly. I think that there was an assumption that the Loeffler race, of course, would go into the runoff on January 5th, but the hope was that Purdue would be able to avoid that by getting more than 50% of the vote in Georgia. Obviously, that did not happen, so there is going to be a runoff for both of those. I do believe that the Republican, both Purdue and Loeffler, are the favorites going into that runoff in January. And Republicans, of course, only have to win one of those two races in order to maintain control of the Senate. While they might be the favorites, though, who knows exactly what's going to happen between now and January 5th. And then, of course, what the impact of the various discussions, I'll put it mildly, that have taken place in the results of the election regarding kind of the integrity of the election and things like that. So I know that that's had an impact as well in Georgia. But we'll see how that goes. At the U.S. Chamber, we're very supportive of both Senators Perdue and Loeffler. And we've already launched our first round of ads this week in support of both of those folks running for election in Georgia. But I think on the Senate side, a very good night for Republicans and a good night as well for the business community moving forward. On the House side, as I mentioned, we endorsed about 30 House Democrats. I think it was 22 freshman Democrats. We had a good night with most of those folks. The majority of those folks ended up winning. A number of them, however, did not win, of course, because Republicans had a very strong showing as well in the House and were able to pick up several seats. That was quite a surprise to folks. But either way, I think that the U.S. Chamber, we're going to be in good position to build relationships with those Republicans coming in. You look at the state of California, where we did endorse Democrats such as Harley Ruda, just to the north of you all in California 48, as well as T.J. Cox in California 21 in the Central Valley. Both of those gentlemen lost to David Valadao, the former Republican congressman from the Central Valley, and then to Michelle Steele, of course, the Orange County supervisor. We've had a longstanding relationship with David Valadao, and I think that we have a good chance of developing a strong relationship with Michelle Steele as well. But we were happy to see most of those centrist Democrats win, and we're happy to see a lot of, which is quite frankly, a lot of the folks that we endorse generally in that House, in the various House races win. We had over 200 candidates that we had endorsed running for re-election in the House that were victorious. So that was great to see. Looking at the House and kind of what that's going to look like in the next Congress, very, very tight margin. This is going to be one of the tightest margins of control that we've seen in several decades, where Democrats are only going to maintain a 9-vote advantage. The makeup, I believe, is going to be about 222 to 213, with the most recent races being called in California 21, California 25, Iowa 2, where after the recount, the Republican Miller Meeks has a 6-vote lead. That's the closest race in the country. It's pretty remarkable. But Republicans also having a very strong showing in the House. Of course, as a lot of you are aware, forecasts going into the election show that they were likely to lose seats, potentially even 10, 15 seats, somewhere in that range. Of course, Republicans ended up picking closer to a dozen seats. So a huge swing there. And what that means is that we're going to be faced with divided government. That's what the people have sent us in Washington, D.C. We're going to have a very, very tight majority for Democrats in the House. We're probably going to have a Republican Senate and then a Democrat president. And so that's going to mean that right out of the gates, really, that President Biden is going to have to work with Republicans in the Senate in order to get things done, not only in order to get positions, in the various agencies filled and things like that, and make sure that they get Republican or can garner Republican approval. But then also just, as far as the legislative slate is concerned and what policies the president and his party are able to push, obviously that is going to be constrained as well. And so this is really kind of a unique set of circumstances in that we usually don't have this, right? So if you think back to Trump in 2016 having unified government control under Republicans, Obama in 2008 under Democrats, that's kind of typically been the case. And as a matter of fact, if Republicans do retain the Senate, this will be the first time since 1884 that a Democrat president will not have a Democrat Senate coming in his first term. So it's pretty unprecedented what we're seeing. And what that also means is that instead of seeing a year or two of largely partisan bills being pushed through the House, pushed through the Senate, and ultimately signed into law that thereby alienate the other party, you're probably not going to see that right out of the gates, especially in dealing with this pandemic. I think you're going to have to see a lot of bipartisanship. You're going to have to see a lot of working across the aisle. And that's where I think the U.S. Chamber has positioned itself very, very well. And the fact that we have built really strong relationships. Of course, we've had strong relationships with Republicans historically, but over the last several years, we've really focused a lot of our efforts on building relationships with Democrats, with centrist, pro-business Democrats, even such as Democrats like Congressman Levin, your representative, and trying to find those common ground issues so that we can kind of find the bipartisan support that's needed to address big issues, whether it's related to the pandemic, obviously, like now, or related to infrastructure, immigration. Obviously, there are several issues that continue to be out there that are going to need to be addressed, hopefully, in 2021. So I think that puts us in very good position. I think it puts the business community and chamber community in general in good position to kind of weigh in and have some considerable influence over the next couple of years. That's kind of the overall election breakdown. And then as it regards to the pandemic and what is likely to happen in the lame duck and then kind of beyond into 2021, I think it'd be remiss if I didn't mention the current state of affairs on that, because that's kind of the number one issue that continues to be out there. Of course, Congress has a very limited window to act on the next coronavirus relief package. They're only scheduled to be in DC for about 2 more weeks, really up until December 11th. That's when the House is expected to adjourn. That's so obvious. That's also when we have the deadline for government funding. And that's really kind of the window that we're looking at to get another COVID deal done. Of course, talks really stalled up to, leading up to the election. After the election, Secretary Mnuchin and Speaker Pelosi didn't talk until, yesterday. But now it seems as though things are starting to move a little bit again. There was a press conference put together yesterday morning by several Republican and Democrat members of the Senate, as well as leading folks on the Problem Solvers Caucus in the House. That's a group of 25 Republicans and 25 Democrats, moderate folks that are in the House. They came together with kind of the framework of a $908 billion package that would address the pandemic, that would reopen the Paycheck Protection Program, for example. It devotes about $280 billion for that program. Also reauthorizes the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, more money for EIDL. There's $180 billion or so for unemployment insurance, $300 per week supplemental for 18 weeks, things like that. There's more assistance for airlines that have really been hit hard, that haven't been able to get access to federal assistance for the last several months. So there's a lot of good provisions, and there's also language on liability protections, at least temporary liability protections. So there's a lot of good stuff that's in there. Hopefully that'll be a positive framework that the Senate will be willing to move on. McConnell's kind of given some indications that might not necessarily be the case, but I think that over the next week and a half or so, we've got a good shot of getting at least something into the continuing resolution, the omnibus package that's going to pass or need to pass by December 11th. I think that's probably our best shot to get some of these things inserted, and then hopefully we can start kind of with the new slate in 2021 after we get a relief deal, and we can move to things like infrastructure, workforce development, which is going to be really key now, and then immigration, things like that later in 2021. But that's kind of where things are at policy-wise, and I think I've given a pretty lengthy rundown of the election as well. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. I just put a note in the chat box that anybody's welcome to put a question there. I should have mentioned that before you started, Jennings, that during your presentation that people could put questions in and we'd call them out afterwards. So anybody have questions for Jennings before we move along to the local and state election wrap up?
Teresa, I do have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
Jennings, I really appreciate your summary. I thought it was excellent. My question involves the Georgia election. If you looked at the numbers from the primary, it seemed like Purdue was awfully close to 50%. And then on the other side, Loeffler and Collins combined had more than, I think, 60%. So would that not indicate, unless there's something nefarious that goes on, that they should have the advantage going in?
Yeah. No, I think that they do have the advantage, and you're right on those numbers. And I think, Georgia, despite going for Biden, obviously this time around, is still it's still a Republican state. It's still a red state, although not nearly as red maybe as it used to be. And then you look at the fact that I think, quite frankly, probably having Biden in as president helps as well, because that'll create another incentive for voters to vote for a check, essentially, against him and against having unified Democrat control of government. So I think that's going to play a role. And then also, if you look at just kind of historic turnout rates in these runoff elections, it really drops off quite a bit after the general in the state of Georgia whenever this happens. And whenever you have that kind of drop off in turnout, that historically has benefited Republicans running. So I think that's also kind of another situation that we're going to have to watch. But I think both Loeffler and Purdue are the favorites at this point.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Great. Maybe one more question before we move along. Anybody else? Question for Jennings? All right. Well, thank you, Jennings, for being here with us. It's always nice to have you, and we appreciate the wrap up. I know there's a lot to talk about, so you might want to put your contact info in the chat box so that people can follow up with any other questions that they forgot to mention now but wanted to follow up with later.
Sounds good.
Yeah, thank you. Let's move along to John Dadian. Thank you for being here, John. He's going to give a wrap up of the local and state elections.
Good morning, everyone. Jennings, that was an absolutely excellent recap of everything, and I agreed with everything you said. One thing I want to emphasize, I'll just mention one thing on the national, then I'll go to all the local stuff, but it can't be overlooked that Biden and McConnell have a personal relationship. They've worked together for years, et cetera. And I think that's the biggest change that I see that you're going to see. Clearly, they're going to disagree publicly, et cetera. But behind the scenes, these two guys get along, and I think they're both going to do the right thing. On a personal note, I'm going to lay it on thick because a lot of people have said congratulations to Teresa. But I will tell you what my initial thought was when she told me that she was running for office. And my initial thought was, this is somebody who's doing it for the right reasons. I mean, we all know a lot of elected officials who are doing it for the title or doing it for other reasons. She's really doing it. And although she's the city of Carlsbad, I would say that she epitomizes the slogan from the county of San Diego, and that is the noblest motive is the public good. So all of us sharing congratulations. I'm going to try to talk regionally about how some regional issues affect the city of Carlsbad, because obviously you folks know about the city itself much more than I do. But I'll just mention a couple quick things about the city, and then I'll go to all the regional aspects. So I think the two most important things, obviously your Chamber of Commerce, is that the county just approved $20 million in funding for small business stimulus. And the way they're going to do that is they're going to divide it up among the supervisorial districts. So if you're not aware of that, I would encourage you to start lobbying right away to your county supervisor, because he has a pot of $4 million that, of course, he has to spread out through his district. But clearly, Carlsbad is a very important aspect of his district. And also, staying on those same lines, is be aware that the state has just did a state sales tax deferral that's in effect now. And again, contact your state representative if you need help with that. But anybody that would be eligible for that, I would strongly encourage you to do it. And I'll just also note, again, Jenny's mentioned COVID in general. We all know that's the number one issue. But I've been watching that pretty closely, and it's interesting. Carlsbad is one of the lowest numbers in the region, and everywhere it's rising, but it's still one of the lowest in the region. So I congratulate Carlsbad on that. So I'm going to talk about the main changes in the region, but here's a little trivia. Again, you're all insiders. We all know the cliche that every vote counts, but in case you're not aware of watching all the local, most cities, including Carlsbad, have gone to district elections. So there's one city out in the East County that the latest count last night shows one council race, a difference of 5 votes. So if you weren't aware of that one, that's the one we're all watching closely, because every vote definitely counts. Here's something to remember. This was the last election cycle before redistricting. And so the next time, 2 years from now, going to have completely different districts in Congress, in Assembly, Senate, those types of things. Obviously, Carlsbad does its own. Ever since California became a state in 1850, it has never lost a congressional seat. Up until 10 years ago, it increased, and 10 years ago, it just stayed the same. It's predicted for the next election cycle that California will lose between 1 and 2 congressional seats. I think that's going to be mostly in northern LA County and the Central Valley. But I think what will happen in San Diego is we say we have 5-member Congress, but 2 of those share with other counties. So I think that will consolidate us here. We'll have 4 completely solid members. But that is going to be a huge change between now and the next election cycle. I'm going to talk about the county of San Diego and the city of San Diego, because that's the largest city in the region. But I think sometimes us locals forget how big it is here. City of San Diego is the 8th largest city in the region. The county is the 5th largest county in the entire country. So think about this for a second. The population of the county of San Diego is larger than 21 states. So when the Board of Supervisors every Tuesday vote on some issues, et cetera, they're voting on issues that will affect people more than 21 governors. I don't think many parts of the country can brag about that. Everybody's aware. I'll be switching to the county now. Everybody's aware of the major changes that have happened for the first time in decades, that it's going to be a Democrat majority. When I first came down to San Diego, there was one Democrat on the board, and he was great to work with. But now things have changed. California, I always say, is not a blue state; it's a deep blue state, and San Diego's starting to reflect that. two major issues I think that will, the two major aspects of the county that I think a Democrat majority will affect is health and human services and law enforcement. Obviously with COVID, Supervisor Fletcher has taken the lead, but also Supervisor Cox in the South Bay was co-chair of the COVID task force, and Nora Vargas will be taking his place. Again, a Democrat. I hate to label people, she's liberal, but she's, again, a very decent person who I think ran for the right reasons. So what you're going to see in the region is you're going to see the county focusing more on social service type issues than the Republican board has in the past. I mentioned law enforcement, and you're probably wondering, Carlsbad has their own police department. Well, keep in mind, the sheriff's department is responsible for 9 out of 18 cities and the entire unincorporated area. So there are many issues that affect Carlsbad, even though they're not under the sheriff's department, such as joint task force and those type of things. Now, the reason I bring that up, that I think there'll be a change, is, as I said, the Democrat majority is going to start focusing more on social issues. So I think they're going to start looking at the sheriff's budget. And the Deputy Sheriff's Association has always been a power as far as supervisor elections, but I think that's diminished now because of the change. And you're going to see, I think they're looking at, scaling back on some of the budget items for the sheriff's department. Even though the sheriff's an elected official, the Board of Supervisors is in charge of his budget. And again, the unions will have a much more power at the County of San Diego than they ever had for decades. Shifting to the city of San Diego, I already mentioned it's the 8th largest city, but there's 9 members on the council, and then you've got the mayor, which is off the council, is what they refer to as strong mayor form of government. But of 9 council members, 5 of them are not only new, of majorities not only new, but all 5 of them are first-time elected officials. So you're going to see some very interesting dynamics going on with that board as far as people jockeying what committees to get on and that type of thing. Now, when you add the mayor, that means in the city of San Diego, out of 9 elected positions, 6 are going to be from the Democratic, you're going to have 6 that are new. Now, of the 9 on council, there's only 1 Republican left. Now, on one hand, you might think, okay, that's a supermajority. The Republican might not get his way on certain things. Actually, my prediction, which has surprised a couple people, the reverse is almost going to be true. Because, and that's Councilman Cate I'm referring to, because he's the only Republican on council, whenever the council does anything with the Democratic majority, the media is going to go to Councilman Cate to get his reaction to everything. So I think you're going to see, it's a blessing in disguise that he's going to have a much higher profile being the only Republican on. Obviously, Carlsbad is part of Sandag, and you've seen some changes in recent years with Sandag, most prominently that the city of San Diego and the city of Chula Vista now have skewed, more of a weighted vote than before. And I think what you've seen recently, you're going to continue to see, and that is those 2 cities, as far as their votes, are going to, I don't want to exaggerate and say run roughshod, but they're going to get their way on issues that affect the entire region, including the city of Carlsbad. Transportation, the head of Sandag right now wants to do this massive transportation hub, which is going to cost billions and billions of dollars. And I think you're going to see a lot of pushback on that. But will that actually pushback be successful because of the way to vote? I certainly don't have an answer. And of course, the last major change that's going to happen is the switching to the state of California as far as regional politics, and that is that we're going to have a new senator. And the way each state is different as the way they fill a vacancy. In the state of California, it's the governor's authority to appoint without any confirmation or anything. He gets to appoint whoever he wants. Now, as to repeat myself, I've said California is a deep blue state, so clearly the pool is huge. You got all 8 constitutional office holders are Democrats. You got the mayor of Los Angeles, you got the mayor of San Francisco, and you got several members of the congressional delegation. So he's got a big pool to choose from. And there's a couple of San Diegos in San Diego region that are serious contenders for that. And of course, the biggest rumor is that the possibility that he could arrange it to, the governor could arrange it to appoint himself. The way he would do that is he'd have to resign, and then the lieutenant governor would become governor and appoint him. So that's a possibility. Strange things happen in California politics, so we don't know. I realize I speak fast, so I certainly hope there'll be a few questions.
It looks like we already have a question for you. Deb asks, is California losing congressional seats because so many people are leaving the state?
Yes, that's exactly right. And again, just to briefly talk about a civics lesson. So every 10 years for redistricting, it's based on population throughout the country. Roughly, I'll use round numbers, roughly a congressional district has about 650,000 members. So that's across the country. And so if one state, has less than that, that's where the shift happens. Here's some good trivia for you. Obviously, I like trivia. Is of the 50 states, 9 states only have one member of Congress. You have to have at least one. So those states have less than 650,000 state population. So think about this for a second. In those 9 states, realistically, not technically, but realistically, the member of Congress has more power than the 2 senators because there's only one of them throughout the entire state. Well, you got 2 senators for every state. So yes, there is a big flight. Again, I'm hearing different numbers as far as which states are going to be picking up. Probably Texas, probably some in the Northeast. Again, for many decades in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was called the Rust Belt was losing people that were all flocking to California. And that's why we increased up until 10 years ago. But times change and the pendulum always keeps swinging.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to the chat questions first. I know I see some hands. Tri-City Board election, do you have any info for us on that?
Actually, I really don't. I'm not that familiar. I know who the members are. I really did not stay to go over my notes for that. Apologize.
No worries. Do you have any insight on the agenda of the city of San Diego as it relates to Sandag and its direction?
Well, I'll answer that question specifically, but let me just say before I talk about the relationship to Sandag, let me say the city of San Diego, like all cities, including Carlsbad, clearly the number one issue is not specifically COVID, but COVID as it relates to the budget. And they're looking at some very hard decisions. And so that will affect everything, including the relationship with Sandag. But to answer the question directly, specifically talking about Sandag, Sandag's role, among other things, is clearly transportation. And it's the age-old fight that's been going on for years. And that is, again, I hate to label people, but the conservatives of both parties, want to focus more on road repairs, that type of thing. And the ones with a more progressive agenda want to focus more on public transportation, clean air type of transportation options, et cetera. So that's the continual battle that you're going to be seeing going on. And again, with San Diego now having a huge majority of Democrats, you're going to see them with the weighted vote really pushing more of the public transportation focus.
Great, thank you. It doesn't look like there are any other questions in the chat, and I do see Crystal put in the link to the San Diego stimulus grant information. So, and I know she's going to speak in just a second. What about Tom Robertson? I see your hand is up.
John, what's your reaction to the mayor of San Diego, Falconer, announcing the possibility he might run for governor?
I've given several interviews on this subject. So on one hand, I'm going to give a typical John Dadian pros and cons, and I hope it doesn't sound like I'm going to contradict myself. On one hand, for the state, if anybody of the Republican Party has a chance, it'd be Kevin Faulconer for numerous reasons. The biggest reason is the overall analysis, including my own, is that he's done a good job in about a little over 7 years. Clearly, he's considered a moderate. One thing he's done with the city council is, worked across the political lines, et cetera. So all those things bode well for his candidacy and for his chances and possibility. On the other hand, I'm going to repeat myself. This is not a blue state. It's a deep blue state. And quite frankly, I just don't see it with the registration. It would really have to be some type of dramatic change. Maybe COVID goes away, maybe something dramatic happens. But right now, even with our current governor having I think it's fair to say he has a lot of baggage with the way he's handled COVID. A lot of people are upset with the way that he's hurt business, but with just pure registration, I can't see a Republican candidate swinging that many Democrat. And of course, the decline to state vote is huge in California. I just don't see them swinging the registration that would say that realistically it's a possibility. I thought, and I thought this was the worst known secret. I thought he was going to, and I've said this publicly, I thought he was going to go to the San Diego Chamber of Commerce and replace Jerry Sanders. It's a pretty good job for numerous reasons, but clearly he's absolutely strongly considering running for governor.
All right. I see in the chat that there's some other comments about Tri-City. Do we have any other questions for John Dadian before we move on to Tri-City? Other questions? Hands, you want to unmute? No? Okay, great. Thank you for a very comprehensive overview. And it's a pleasure to have you. And thank you for your nice comments. We look forward to staying in close touch with you here at the Chamber. Thank you. Let's move on along to Aaron to answer the question about Tri-City and the elections.
Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. Tri-City had, as Tri-City typically does, a fairly robust election process. The people that came out ahead, and obviously it hasn't been certified yet, but it's pretty clear in most cases here. The people that won are so there's 4 seats of the 7 that were up, and so Nina Chaya, who is an anesthesiologist who works at the hospital, but actually she works for another organization that's contracted with the hospital. So she won with about 70% of the vote in her district, which covers Carlsbad. Leanne Grass, who is currently the board chair, was running for re-election, and she won her seat with about 75% of the vote. Gigi Gleason, who many of you may know from Oceanside, who is a prominent local community member and volunteer on a number of boards, won a seat that is in Oceanside. By the way, the Leanne Grass district actually kind of runs along the 78 freeway, includes portions of Carlsbad, Oceanside, and Vista. And then the last seat, which covers a portion of Oceanside and a portion of Vista, that was a fairly contentious race. And that was actually won by a former nurse at the hospital, Adela Sanchez, who actually resigned from her position at the hospital to run for that seat. And so she won that seat with about 50% of the vote. 2 other candidates kind of split the remainder of the vote. They will be sworn into office on Friday at the hospital in a small ceremony, socially distanced, of course. But that is what's going on. So we will have 4 new members, actually 3 new members and 1 returning member of the board. 3 of our members who actually served a grand total of 62 years combined recently retired. And that was Rosemary Reno, Larry Shalek, and somebody who's very familiar to the Carlsbad community, Julie Nygaard.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, it looks like all of our questions were answered about local elections, and I put a note to Jennings and John. Please stick around. We'd love to have you for the rest of the meeting. And John, if you want to give your contact information in the chat box in case there are people who have other questions, feel free.